Hello and welcome to the Franz van Kath interview. I'm Annette Young. After the end of 2014, NATO could well and truly find itself without a major military operation to run. Today, the 28-member alliance is probably also better known for its work outside of Europe as opposed to inside. As a result, the organisation is facing a strategic dilemma. One man who knows that all too well is Dr. Jamie Shea. He's the head of the Emerging Challenges Unit at NATO, and he joins me here today at the studio in Brussels at NATO's HQ. Dr. Shea, thank you so much for being with us.
Nice to be with you, Annette.
You've said earlier this year that NATO of the future should not build its raison d'etre primarily or solely on the primacy of its military actions. What, as a result, should its primary objective be?
Well, the objective of the alliance is to guarantee the security of its members. And therefore, if the nature of the threats change, if the way you have to do security business changes, then obviously the alliance has got to adjust in order to remain relevant, not just for the 20th century, we proved it then, but of course for the 21st century. And today we're in a situation where, whether we like it or not, the threats to our populations are much more multiple. They don't come any longer from just one country or one hostile ideology. They don't concentrate conveniently for us on one particular geographical area, like the Fulda Gap, for instance, of Cold War vintage. They come in many shapes or forms. We have cyber attacks, we have terrorism, we have proliferation threats, and we have issues like the hardening of our critical infrastructure. Look at Storm Sandy in the United States, where one storm can inflict such enormous damage, not only to people's homes, but to power cables, to communications, to transport. And climate change, unfortunately, is probably going to bring more of those type of things in the future. So in a nutshell, NATO has to be true to its mandate to protect the security of its peoples, but in order to do so, it has to be able to sort of handle more different tasks with more capabilities than the alliance that I first knew when I came here many years ago.
So how do you make an organisation like NATO relevant?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, is to make sure that as the threats adjust, we adjust. And I think this is happening. We had a new strategic concept a couple of years ago, which really put these new challenges, which I've just been talking about, much more centre stage in the alliance. We created a new division called Emerging Security Challenges to give more focus, more coordination, more synergy to NATO's work. And since that time, we've built up quite significantly our cyber defence capabilities so that we're in a much better situation today to protect our networks from the new kinds of malware that we're seeing. That was the case a few years ago, and we're in a much better position to assist allied countries that come under these kind of cyber challenges by exchanging intelligence, by exchanging know-how. In the area of critical infrastructure protection, we've done a lot to identify vulnerabilities in our systems and how we can harden them. Terrorism, again, when we leave Afghanistan, the terrorist problem from things like roadside bombs will still be with us. So we're trying to capture also a lot of the lessons learned from these operations in dealing with issues like these improvised explosive devices, which are going to be with us anywhere, including in domestic security, and making sure that we don't lose that know-how and we capture it for the long term.
Is it hard, though, to change the mindset of military officials and also government officials who sort of see the world still very much in the way or at the time that NATO was formed, some 60 or so years ago?
Well, there was a famous British historian, Basil Liddell Hart, who famously said that the hardest thing, or one thing harder than to get a new idea into the military mind is to get an old idea out. But I think he was being unfair, quite frankly, because I think in today's NATO, no, our military authorities are adjusting very quickly. For instance, they've been used over the last few years to a whole new method of working. They have to be able to work, for example, in places like Afghanistan with the civilian authorities and agencies in reconstruction. They have to be able to launch several operations simultaneously. Well, we have Afghanistan, but elsewhere we're doing training, for example, for the African Union in Africa, or we're doing capability building, or we're transporting African Union soldiers, or we're doing counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden. So I think the military are adjusting and becoming more flexible. And if you look look at issues like cyber in the United States, in France, in the UK, most allied countries now, you see much more emphasis on this issue, not just as a problem for banks or for private individuals with credit card fraud, but as a national security threat with the risk to military command and control systems, as I've said, to power lines, to transport systems. But of course, the military can't solve these problems by themselves, as they could deal, for example, with Soviet tanks in the Fulda Gap during the Cold War period. It's not any longer a military response to a military problem. This time, the military have to lock into other efforts of the intelligence services in predicting the attacks, the police in dealing with domestic security, the federal emergency management services after Hurricane Katrina, for example, in terms of evacuating people. So, in other words, we're talking about a comprehensive approach. The military are an important part of the action, but they're only good if they can work with others and persuade others to work with them.
When you say work with others, I mean, there are other bodies, there are other people in this equation. For instance, how do you work with 28 member states with various government departments, for instance, with cyber warfare, where you're going to have to access information from interior ministries, and those are the sort of mindset of those officials are probably not that open to sharing that sort of information.
It's a slow process sometimes, you're right, bureaucracies are bureaucracies, but I think that if you look at many national governments now, they really are doing this. For example, the United States has had since the end of the Second World War a National Security Council. Many other countries in NATO, like the UK, Germany, have created exactly that, a National Security Council. We even have a crisis management organisation in the UK called COBRA, which is a ministerial committee. I mention this because, as I say, I think many allies are going down this road. In other words, which integrates all of the know-how in a crisis of these various agencies, but makes certain that they're coordinated, they're not duplicating each other, they're not chasing after events. So to some degree, this is the model for the future. A crisis, if I could say so, is bad, but sometimes a crisis also helps. And if you look at cyber, where there are thousands of attacks going on every day, if you look at the fact that Al-Qaeda, whether we like it or not, is not going to be contained in Afghanistan or Pakistan, but is spreading out in Africa and elsewhere. As I say, if you look at the increasing prevalence of earthquakes and storms around the world with the threat to infrastructure, whether we like it or not, I think there are going to be lots of crises in the future which are going to keep our noses to the grindstone.
If you had to prioritise the challenges that lie ahead for this organisation, what would be the number one?
Well, I think the important thing for NATO, first and foremost, is to manage its military capabilities in an age of budgetary decline. As I said before, NATO's military capabilities can't provide 100% of the solution. But without military capabilities, there is no solution. So we must make sure that we still have sufficient capability to be a relevant actor. And of course, as you know, at an age when budgets are going down because of the financial crisis, in Europe, in fact, going down to very low levels. In an age where the United States, even the United States, is cutting back, may have to do more because of its balanced budget law, we're going to have to do better with less. And so the first challenge for the alliance is how can we pool and share our capabilities? How can we specialise across allied countries? How can we have a more rational approach so that at least we get the best bang for the buck, to use the old expression, for what we still have? That's going to be the first challenge. The second challenge after Afghanistan is to make sure that we maintain this network of partnerships. You know, we have your country, Australia, with us in Afghanistan. We have Mongolia, we have Malaysia, we have a vast coalition. And this has been good for NATO, but it's also helped us to share the burden. And we've got to make sure that we keep these partnerships together, because we don't want to spend months or even years recreating them when the next operation comes along. Third and final challenge is going to be to make sure, along the lines that we were talking about, that NATO remains adapted to deal with the new challenges so that we're ahead of the game and we're not running behind trying to catch up.
Money is clearly an issue at the moment.
Always.
But even more so, we have a global financial crisis. European governments are slashing their defence budgets. The United States is carrying 75% of the load. Given the current economic situation, particularly here in Europe, that's not going to change, is it?
No, you're right. It's not going to change. But Rahm Emanuel, who is the mayor of Chicago, has a great saying. He says, never waste a good crisis. And crises are also opportunity. In fact, the Chinese word for crisis means opportunity as well as great danger. And if you look at Europe, we've been wasting a lot of money for years. We have in Europe, for example, 4 different kinds of fighter aircraft program, 13 different kinds of armoured personnel program, where the United States has got these down to just 1 or 2. So there's still in Europe a great deal of waste in terms of duplication. We have too many military academies, too many training grounds. 95%, Annette, 95% of all European forces, even today, are nationally constituted, nationally led. Only 2% of European defence budgets are spent on multinational cooperation. So this is a crisis which gives the Europeans in the NATO, in particular, the opportunity to do what they should have done years ago, to pool and share, to develop multinational approaches. Because even with reduced budgets, we can still get a lot more capability than we're getting at the moment. But we've got to seize that opportunity.
And with Washington making clear, particularly now with the re-election of President Obama, that it's very much reorientating itself towards the Asia-Pacific, is it not the case that Europe has to step up to the plate more?
Well, I think that clearly the Europeans have to take care of responsibilities in their neighbourhood, but don't get the impression that the United States is abandoning Europe. I think that would be grossly exaggerated, even wrong. Look at Libya, where the United States provide enormous backing to the European allies involved in the air campaign. Look at President Obama's decision to work with the allies to set up a European missile defence system here to protect NATO territory. Look at the way in which the United States is still committed to NATO training, NATO exercises, and sending a brigade team back to Europe every year for this purpose. So I don't see that suddenly the US is abandoning Europe and pivoting in Asia, but it's also true, and Europe has to take heed of that the United States does see increased responsibilities in the Asia-Pacific theatre. And to some degree, Europe is a much more pacified place now than it was for most of the 20th century. So Europeans certainly have to share more of the burden in the alliance, but I think that when it comes to the defence of NATO territory or all major operations, we can still count on our Canadian and US allies to be with us, as they always have been.
Dr. Jamie Shea, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, and that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Do stay with us for more news and headlines coming up very shortly.